Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for hanging in there with us. Welcome to AGU's 2020 Policy Priorities webinar. Thank you all for taking some time out of your day to be here. We're so happy to have you here with us. My name is Caroline Gleason, and I'm one of the interns on the Public Affairs team here at AGU. I have to admit my internship has been a little bit different than what I was expecting. For one, instead of attending congressional hearings in person down in DC, I'm streaming them from my parents' house in Maine, a little bit different. But what hasn't differed from my expectations is the work itself. Science policy is still happening, and our public affairs team continues to advocate for science and for our scientific community on issues ranging from support for students and early career scientists in COVID response legislation to the protection of the electromagnetic spectrum for use by the GPS and weather communities and everything in between. As I've adjusted to this new normal, as I'm sure you all feel, I'm struck by just how salient our policy priorities remain, even as our daily lives have changed so dramatically. AGU's core policy issues of diversity and inclusion, of scientific integrity, of science funding, and of resiliency are still top of mind, and that's what our team would like to share with you today. So let's get into it. Our webinar today is being recorded and will be made available online, so look out for an email with that information next week. We'll also have some time for a Q&A at the end of the session, so as you're listening along, please feel free to type any questions you have into the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen. Now I'll pass it along to Liz Landau, our Director of Public Affairs, to get us officially started. Liz?
Thank you so much for sharing that, Caroline, and thank you everyone for being here today. I'm Elizabeth Landau, and I want to share with you why we have policy priorities at AGU and how we determine what they will be each year. Then I'm going to share information specifically about the elections taking place in 2020. And after that, my colleagues will cover each policy priority in detail, and we'll also share AGU's response to COVID-19. After that, we will have time for questions. So as Caroline said, please go ahead and put them in the chat box throughout the presentation. Next slide, please. So as you likely know, AGU sciences span at least 23 different disciplines, covering a huge swath of the earth and space sciences. Each of these disciplines is associated with many societal issues and different scientific priorities. So by selecting a few cross-cutting science policy priorities, it allows us to focus our attention on issues that are relevant to most of our community and will provide the greatest benefit both for the scientific community and for society at large. Another benefit of selecting a few priorities is that it allows us to clearly articulate the value of science to policymakers in a framework that connects easily to issues that they already care about. This is a really helpful communication tool when working with those who aren't as versed in the science as the researchers themselves. Next slide, please. In order to select these few cross-cutting science policy priorities that will meet this criteria, we look to issues that are broadly relevant to multiple AGU disciplines, provide the greatest benefit both for the scientific community and for society at large, align with the AGU strategic plan, of course, and are likely to activate policymakers to take action on our issues. For 2020, those four priorities are to fund scientific innovation in the earth and space sciences for the benefit of humanity, to create a diverse and inclusive 21st century workforce, to ensure science can contribute to society freely and without interference, and to build a more resilient society. We will be covering each of these in detail shortly. First, I want to share a little bit about what AGU is doing regarding elections happening around the world this year. Next slide, please. 2020 is an election year in the US and many other countries, including Ethiopia, South Korea, France, Bolivia, and many more. AGU is asking members to pledge to vote, and we are providing resources to help our members vote and engage in 2020 elections. We really need science-supported policymakers at all levels, from local to federal, in order to make progress on our policy priorities. And unfortunately, in some places like the United States, STEM student voting rates are among the lowest of any field of study, with only 34% voting in the 2018 election. So we encourage STEM students and scientists alike to vote. Next slide, please. Given the essential role that science plays in society, AGU is asking you to pledge to vote right now by texting AGU vote to 52886. You will find resources for connecting virtually with candidates, updates on changes to primary dates in the US, and information about voting early and by mail on our website, sciencevotesthefuture.org. And there are a lot of other useful tools as well. The resources will be available all year, and each month we will help you focus on another aspect of election-related engagement. It's a really quick and easy way to help yourself stay up to date with minimal effort. And now I'm going to go ahead and hand things off to Brittany Webster, who will start our overview of our 4 policy priorities.
Thanks so much, Liz. As Liz stated, my name is Brittany Webster, and I'm the program manager for our public affairs team. And today I'm going to be talking about what AGU is doing to build that 21st century workforce in the policy space. Next slide. And I want to start by outlining that diversity and inclusion is a problem in the sciences, specifically within the earth and space sciences. And I want to preface by saying that these are just a couple of snapshots of the diversity and inclusion issues within the sciences, and that there are many more facets to this issue. Some of you may remember this rather provocative New York Times story from December 2019, highlighting the lack of diversity in the geosciences. Additionally, many of us have seen the alarming sexual harassment facts from various sources, including the national academies, that point to a larger cultural problem within the sciences. What's more, as demonstrated by this study in Nature, these cultural issues are detrimental to science itself. As to why this is a problem that AGU needs to take on, I'll paraphrase a recent op-ed by Robin Bell and Lisa White, saying, "This lack of diversity means that we are missing those who could help us find solutions to the biggest scientific questions we face." Next slide, please. So what is DEI? So I'm going to take a step back and define these. These are some really good definitions for diversity, equity, and inclusion. But what I really want you to remember is the school dance metaphor that I think we can all relate to. Diversity is where everyone is invited to the party. Equity means that everyone gets to contribute to the playlist. And finally, inclusion means that everyone has the opportunity to dance. So sometimes diversity, equity, and inclusion can really be hard to navigate situationally, and I think this is a great situational metaphor for us to keep in mind as we talk about these issues. Next slide, please. Some of you may be asking yourself, well, what about equality? You know, for years, that's what we were talking about, and why is that no longer enough? So here's another great demonstration that treating everyone equally does not often create inclusion or equal opportunity the way we might hope. Next slide, please. So as you may have heard, DEI is a big priority for AGU. And the way many of you have probably experienced this is through AGU's Safe AGU program at Fall Meeting, Ocean Sciences, or other Chapman conferences. But really, this is such a big priority for AGU that we developed a diversity and inclusion strategic plan in 2018. And you can see the vision and goals from that plan here in that diagram. And part of what developed out of that is the AGU Ethics and Equity Center, which provides trainings for scientific workplaces, provides resources, and serves as a consortium as the host of a consortium for other scientific societies to band together to address this issue. Additionally, AGU's new strategic plan has 3 goals, and the second goal is all about improving AGU's DEI culture, which you can see here. Additionally, here's kind of the title of that piece I mentioned that was written by AGU's President Robin Bell and Lisa White, who's the chair of AGU's Diversity and Inclusion Committee. So this is a big priority for AGU, and it continues and will continue to be a priority for AGU. Next slide, please. So what does this look like on the policy front? I think I've talked a lot about the first bullet point, but I want to talk about the second point a little bit. And this is equally important because a big part of building that 21st century workforce is just getting more students into the pipeline before we turn to really thinking about how do we ensure they stay in the pipeline. And this policy aim is really based on our position statement calling for more and better earth and space science education in K through 12. Next slide, please. And on the policy front, there are really 4 ways that we as a team have been thinking about building that future scientific workforce. As the U.S. has become the not so obvious leader in science and technology, it's also been a huge priority on Capitol Hill. And we've seen lots of congressional and legislative attention in these first 2 buckets, eliminating obstacles and creating opportunities. So here are some bills that AGU is currently engaging with Congress on these issues, but this is by no means an exhaustive list of bills. The second two buckets are areas where we as a policy team have been trying to broaden our engagement and think differently about our policy work. Many issues in the earth and space sciences are felt, and solutions need to be developed not only on the national level, so how can we work locally, nationally, and internationally? And scientific societies alone cannot conquer many of the issues we're concerned about, kind of those grand challenges that society needs to address. So what are the other organizations that we can work with and build relationships with to develop more holistic policy solutions? Next slide, please. So you might be asking, those are some really big goals. How can you act on these issues? So we actually have our first ever Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Virtual Advocacy Day. It's going to be this June, and we'll be focusing on these three bills that we think have some potential to move this Congress. And again, I want to just restate that there are a ton of other STEM and science bills out there. These are just some bills that we think have the strongest potential of advancing or even passing. Although in the age of coronavirus, everything is much more up in the air. Additionally, Congress does have to pass their spending bills this year, and they are working on those bills right now. So asking for increased funding for programs like these is really one avenue to raise these issues with your legislators. And finally, here are just a couple of timely hooks, especially if you may be thinking it's hard to talk about anything other than the pandemic right now. This might be a way to make these issues seem particularly relevant to your legislators. And with that, I'll turn it over to Caitlin. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Brittany. My name is Caitlin Bergstrom. I am the Public Affairs Analyst for AGU's Science Policy team, and I'm going to be talking about scientific integrity. You go to the next slide. So one of our main priorities in 2019 as well as 2020 is ensuring that science can contribute to society freely and without interference. And this includes supporting legislation that ensures that science can be conducted and inform policy freely, openly, and without undue political interference. I think that we have seen today that there seems to be a lot of political interference happening with scientists with this ongoing pandemic, but it happens in the earth and space sciences as well. And I'm going to talk about some specific earth and space science related issues that we are concerned about. Next slide. So how is science being interfered with? What are some ways? So there are a few key issues. I'll go into detail on a couple of these, but the EPA has a science transparency rule that has been in the news quite a bit in the last couple of weeks and for the last several years. In 2018, they proposed a regulation that would limit the amount or the kind of science that could be used to write regulations within the EPA, stating that they would not consider the use of research to support regulations that did not have all of the data publicly available. And this sounds like kind of a nice guise for open science, but what the implication of this is that there's a lot of public health data or other data that contains private or proprietary information that can't and shouldn't be made wholly available to the public, would need to be excluded. So earlier this year in March, the EPA released a supplemental regulation to this rule, stating that they would now require that all data and models needed to be publicly available, and they introduced this rank tiered system. Feels a little bit convoluted, but that's going on at the EPA. There's also been some NEPA regulatory reform happening. There were some rollbacks on NEPA that had never been made before. There have been several scientific agency relocations from Washington, D.C. to other parts of the country. So one that was particularly impactful, the USDA relocated 2 of its offices that had about 400 employees from Washington, D.C. to Kansas City, Missouri. 75% of those employees ended up quitting, and these are agencies that do a lot of research grants within the USDA. So there's scientific research that's being stalled because these people were given a choice between relocating their families and their careers or leaving, and a lot of them chose to leave. There have also been several federal advisory committee cuts that have happened, and issues with whistleblower protections as scientists at federal agencies. So this sounds a little bit doom and gloom. If you want to go to the next slide. But there are things that we can do, and AGU tries within our power to advocate to help reduce this kind of interference. So for that, the EPA rule I was speaking to just a minute ago, there is a comment period open. The comment period got extended, so they're accepting comments through midnight on this upcoming Monday on May 18th. If you are interested in making a comment on this rule, we strongly suggest that you do. Some quick tips, making sure that your comments are specific and only comment on the changes that are being made in this rule, but we would love to see our members and anyone else in attendance for this sort of make this statement. AGU will be submitting our comment in the next couple of days as well. There's also some scientific integrity legislation that's happening within Congress. So the Scientific Integrity Act, which provides whistleblower protections to scientists at agencies, amongst a few other things, has passed the House last year and is waiting to move in the Senate. We also want to be able to provide resources to you so you understand your rights as a scientist. So we partner pretty frequently with the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund, and they have come out with a series of scientific integrity guides. So you can do a little more work to understand what your rights are as a scientist, either at a federal agency, which is the guide that I have pictured here, but they also have a guide on scientific integrity at a research institution. So we can share some of those resources when we share the slides after this presentation, but again, we here at AGU are making sure that our scientists across all fields are able to do their work as impactfully as possible. So with that, I will hand it over to Michael.
Thank you, Caitlin. Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Villafranca, and I am the Senior Specialist on the Public Affairs team here at AGU. And I'm going to talk about our priority for funding scientific innovation in the Earth and space sciences. Next slide, please. So what does this look like, and why is this a priority? Specifically, our priority is to support at least a real 4% increase in funding for the Earth and space sciences within U.S. agencies. This is the recommended level of growth that has been endorsed by over 500 leading industry, higher education, science, and engineering organizations from across all 50 states. Funding the Earth and space sciences has been and will continue to be a significant priority for AGU. A lot of scientific research is funded by the federal government, and many Earth and space scientists are likely to be funded by a mix of grants from one or more science agencies. On the next couple of slides, you will see the specific fiscal year 2021 request that AGU is making for several science agencies and programs. But this is a priority that is critical now more than ever. While scientific innovation relies on steady and sustained growth in funding, the reality is that many science agencies have been inconsistently funded year over year and are currently headed by an administration that consistently seeks deep cuts to science agency budgets. Next slide, please. So how does AGU determine what the request will be? Well, most of AGU's requests are made in collaboration with various coalitions, some of which are specifically focused on a particular agency, such as the Coalition for National Science Funding, whose support focuses on increasing investments at specifically the National Science Foundation, or NSF. Next slide, please. Now, you may look at the percentages and notice that the requests are larger for some agencies and programs and smaller for others and wonder why. Well, this invariability in AGU's request reflects in great part a consideration for the level of which each agency and program has been underfunded over the past several years, or several fiscal years. Next slide, please. But you still have the ability to impact how science agencies and programs are funded in the coming year. In order for science agencies to receive funding, Congress must pass several funding bills that they're still working on. The best means of taking advantage of this opportunity is to connect with your legislators and share your science with them. When legislators understand the value of your science, support for more robust science and increased funding of science grows. So consider where you are currently getting your funding from to do your work, including how that funding has helped you and what the implications are if that funding were to be cut. Think also about how your science benefits society. Does it impact the economy in any way or affect national security? These are the type of things that legislators want to know, especially in terms of how it impacts their particular district or state. Now I will pass it over to my colleague Emily, who will talk about our priority focused on resiliency.
Thanks, Michael, and good afternoon. My name is Emily Orzakowski, and I'm an earth scientist currently serving as an intern with the Public Affairs team. And today I'm going to share with you AGU's resiliency policy priority. Next slide, please. So what is resiliency? Broadly, resiliency is the process of adjusting to new environmental conditions with the goal of reducing risks to our health, society, and economy. It involves the processes of understanding our environment, modeling and forecasting coming changes, comprehensive prevention and planning efforts, as well as mitigation and response processes, all of which include the coordination of governments, scientists, and communities. And at AGU, we believe that strengthening our resiliency framework is really critical because we are at a major turning point in terms of global change. Next slide, please. First, resiliency will be key as we continue to experience the worsening effects of climate change and consequent extreme weather patterns. Across the globe, communities are experiencing changes in rainfall, temperature, and sea level that are already causing diverse consequences, including desertification and coastal inundation. And extreme weather events are also increasing in intensity and frequency, which in the States has most recently manifested in the forms of devastating hurricane seasons and wildfires. Next slide. Alongside climate and weather resiliency, we must also stay resilient to natural hazards, including earthquakes and tsunamis, landslides, and even volcanic eruptions. Next slide. And although it may not be top of mind for most, space weather, including solar and geomagnetic storms, also carry enormous risks that we should be resilient to. These risks include massive disruptions in GPS, communication, aviation, and electrical systems that could inflict over $2 trillion in damage to the US economy during just one extreme space weather event. Next slide. So that's why resiliency is a policy priority for AGU. But what is AGU's resiliency policy approach? And for that, the focus is really on the science side of the policy. So that includes advocating for policies or bills that support research or create science programs centered around resiliency, or advocating bills that apply science to improve a resiliency process, such as better weather forecasting, and also efforts that simply recognize and communicate the value of science for building a more resilient society. Next slide, please. Now, what this approach looks like in action can be, for example, advocating for strong funding in the annual appropriations bills, as Michael was just talking about, or advocating for congressional bills that are focused on strengthening our scientific and institutional resiliency coordination, which this year includes the Pro-SWIFT Act, which is a bill that AGU has endorsed and is focused on enhancing space weather forecasting and mitigation. And a final example of what we're doing is our Surging Waters report, which is a report that communicates the value of science for building resiliency to flooding. Next slide. Now, if you're interested in getting involved in resiliency policy, there's a number of ways you can do so. First, you can reach out to your members of Congress by sending letters, calling their offices, and even setting up a meeting. You can also participate in our congressional visits days, and you can visit our website to engage your members of Congress in our Surging Waters campaign. You can also act more locally by getting involved with your communities with our Thriving Earth Exchange initiative. That initiative is really seeking to facilitate community science projects, and many of which are centered around natural hazards and resiliency. And then finally, you can also share your stories. Why does resiliency science matter to you? And you can do this in a lot of ways. You can give public lectures, write an op-ed, or volunteer for a local organization. And if you're interested in getting more ideas on how to take action, please visit our website. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to our Vice President of Public Affairs, Lexi.
Thank you so much. So this is Lexi Schultz. I'm the Vice President of the team that you've been hearing from so far today. And I just wanted to take a minute to talk about the fact that AGU is very active in thinking about trying to gather information about and trying to help our community respond to some of the impacts that the coronavirus pandemic has had on our community. So even though we create policy priorities at the beginning of every year, we know that we have to remain responsive to everything that comes up. And sometimes there are emerging issues that are a little smaller, but this time it was obviously a very large issue. Next slide, please. So there have been a number of stories in the popular press about some of the impacts to the scientific community, everything from labs going quiet to research meetings being canceled to scientists unable to conduct their own experiments. And we know we've heard from a lot of students and early career scientists in particular about their fears for the future and their ability to publish or continue their programs. We're very interested in hearing what the impacts to you have been. So please go to our email box, sciencepolicy@agu.org. Please share any impacts on you. It helps us to be able to support you during these times. Next slide, please. So there's a few things that AGU is doing. One has been simply outreach to our community. We know that our community in many cases is our best resource. So we put a call out for anyone who has them to donate medical grade supplies. We convened our geohealth experts, so we have a number of them with their information online to act as advisors to policymakers and others. And we have extended the various deadlines for nominations for honors, for workshops, and for meetings, including our fall meeting. Next slide, please. We also have created or amplified some of the virtual resources we have. So you've heard from my colleagues today about all of the kind of online ways in which you can have your voice be heard, whether that's Science Votes the Future or through our Science is Essential page and our AGU Online Action Center. We created an online learning exchange to help the academic community that's been struggling to, very quickly pivot to doing virtual learning. And this exchange has helped both kind of faculty and students. So please go to our website to learn more about that. We have a preprint server that goes by the acronym ESOR, in which students, scientists can share their research, everything from posters to actually pre-published papers. We have on our agu.org site profiles that can help you connect to collaborators that you may not be able to meet with in person. And we're in the process right now of thinking through what a fall meeting would look like if it were entirely or in part virtual. And you will see more information about that in the coming days. We are learning every day from other scientific societies and others that have been translating their meetings to virtual meetings. Next slide. From a policy perspective, AGU has written to Congress both on our own and in collaboration with other science societies and research institutes. We wrote a letter to the House Science Committee specifically asking them to help mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on the scientific enterprise across the board and outlining some of the problems, including some of the things I've talked about today. And a large collective of research institutions, including university associations, asked the House leadership for $26 billion additional in this year's budget to help the science community. and members of Congress have picked up the call themselves. There was both a House letter and a Senate letter sent to the respective leadership of those chambers. The House letter was a bipartisan letter led by Representative DeGette from Colorado and Upton from Michigan, and the Senate letter was led by Senator Markey from Massachusetts and Tillis from North Carolina. And in each case, there were large numbers reiterating the call for an additional $26 billion. And finally, what we're really looking for is additional legislation, but to date, some of the stimulus bills have included some additional monies for science agencies for them to help to provide support through equipment and personnel costs, additional money for research grants, help to support the continuity of experiments that may have been interrupted or stopped, and in many cases, helping scientists gain remote access to their facilities or to decontaminate labs. So this is obviously just a start. We're really just at the beginning of this, enormous situation. So we will not stop here, but I wanted to give just a little bit of a snapshot of how we're trying to respond to date. And with that, I will turn it back to Caroline.
Thank you, Lexi. And I want to say a big thank you to all of our speakers, our public affairs team here at AGU. As mentioned earlier, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available online. So keep an eye out for an email with links to that sometime next week. We also heard a lot about ways that you can take action, particularly in this age of virtual advocacy. A great way to start is to follow our Twitter at AGU Sci Policy, and to sign up for our science policy alerts at the address here, actioncenter.agu.org, for updates and steps you can take as an individual to advocate for science. If there are any policy issues that we haven't mentioned today that you think we should be tracking or things that you want to flag for us, we would love to hear about them. Please send them to our email inbox at sciencepolicy@agu.org. So we are going to open up to questions for the last 15 minutes here. Thank you again to everybody for hanging with us through our technical difficulties at the beginning of the session. You can add your questions into the chat box that should be on your screens. And we have about this 15 minutes to try to get through as many of them as possible. So to get us started, I am going to pose a question to our public affairs team here. How do you gauge how likely a bill will be to move? And how do you decide what legislation to track?
Yeah, so I'll take that one, Caroline. I would say in terms of I would say there are a couple of factors in terms of legislation. We look for legislation, or we try to really support or ensure that legislation that we support is bipartisan. A lot of times, part of it might be knowing if someone on the committee introduces a bill, it's much more likely to pass. So as much as we might really support or really appreciate all members of Congress who are champions for science, if there's a member who is on science committee, for example, we know that legislation is much more likely to pass. And a lot of times how we decide what legislation to support is our members ask us to support legislation. And to give you an example, the space weather legislation that Emily mentioned has really, our efforts on that bill were really sparked by our members and our members on the space physics and astronomy section. And yeah, I don't know if anyone has anything else to add.
Awesome, thank you so much, Brittany. So here's a question for Liz or Lexi. How do these priorities look different from previous years' policy priorities, and what might have caused those changes?
Sure, I can start. Every year, we really take a look at what that year should bring. Is it an election year? Is there a new Congress? what were the issues that moved forward last year versus the issues in legislation that were stalled up. You know, we really take that landscape. Are there any new scientific breakthroughs to keep in mind? And what are the most pressing issues? Our issues this year are many of the similar ones that we had last year, because there are the big cross-cutting type issues that really do affect all of our membership. You know, things like resiliency continues to be an issue because we continue to have so many both natural hazards and also weather and climate related issues that continue to come up. So it's really looking at that broad landscape from year to year. And when we're working with issues that are so large and cross-cutting, oftentimes they are multi-year issues. You know, they're not things that are going to be settled in one particular year. So for that reason, a lot of what we're doing does expand upon things that we have done in the past. And then we have that additional layer of COVID-19, of course, affecting everything this year, and the elections coming up in so many places around the world.
Fantastic. Thank you, Liz. I have got a question for Caitlin. What kinds of things do you take into account when thinking about writing letters or public comments in the case of the EPA secret science rule, for example?
Sure. So I think keeping both our policy priorities in mind when talking about these comments, as well as the priorities of AGU as a whole and our scientists. So in this EPA rule, for example, even though we do have some scientists at EPA, but it's certainly not the agency where we have, or one of the agencies where we have the most membership, but there is certainly there are fundamental issues with the rationale behind this rule. So it's important that that AGU is a big supporter of open science in general. So we also commented on a request for information from the administration just earlier this year that was trying to change some regulations of open science, and this has been a big talking, this has been like quite the talk at AGU, and I think amongst a lot of scientists in general, but this rule is going sort of a bridge too far in what open science is. So with that in mind, sort of talking in the comment, we speak to AGU being a leader in open science. 5 of our journals are fully open access, and just talking about the expertise that scientists do have. One of the sticking points of this regulation was that they believe that the data should be open for independent validation. So it's putting into question the scientific process and the peer review process in general. So I think with those things in mind, that's sort of how we formed the comments.
Awesome. Thank you for that answer, Caitlin.
Mm-hmm.
We have another question. If I want to take action on any of these science issues with my legislators, how do I do that from home? How are legislators moving to a more virtual platform? For anyone on the team, but maybe Liz to get started?
Sure, I'm happy to start that one. Yeah, you can absolutely continue to take action from home. You know, even if you are not going to a legislator's office, whether that's at a local level or at a federal level, you can still make your voice heard. And some of the resources listed right here are actually some of the most helpful ones. You can go to actioncenter.agu.org, which is a really easy way to connect with your legislators. We do a lot of the work for you there, and you can send an email or make a phone call to the offices and connect that way pretty easily, and let them know, you know, what your thoughts are on a particular science policy issue. Another great thing we have is these toolkits online where you can learn how to set up a visit with the legislator. And now policymakers are adapting to our current conditions, and a lot of them are setting up virtual meetings, which could be a phone call or, you know, a Skype or Zoom meeting. And that's another great way to be able to take action right now, even though you're wanting to stay at home at the moment.
Awesome, thank you, Liz. I have a question here for Brittany and anyone else who wants to weigh in. You mentioned that science societies the buck doesn't stop with just us. It's really useful to employ effective partnerships when pursuing diversity, equity, and inclusion goals in our work. What are some examples of some effective partnerships that AGU has had, or other examples on a wider stage?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I would say an example that comes to mind that has nothing to do with DEI, but you know, currently we're working on a really technical issue related to spectrum and the quality of data for our GO satellites. You know, and we're working with a broad coalition of aviation, agriculture. Who else is in the coalition? GPS users. I mean, so it's like a really broad coalition because we're all concerned about spectrum issues. And even though the issue we're fighting right now is more about GPS as opposed to like our GO satellites, it's the same spectrum band. So we're really invested in this. And because, you know, politics makes strange bedfellows, I'll say. And so, but it's been a really powerful coalition, and we've been able to accomplish a lot, despite the fact that we're all working from home and going through this pandemic together.
Awesome, thanks, Brittany. That was a great example. I have a question here for Lexi. How will the pandemic affect other policy priorities going forward?
Yeah, thank you, Caroline. I mean, I think that's something that's on a lot of people's minds. And I will say that congressional offices and congressional staff in particular have not stopped working on other issues. Obviously, a stimulus response, looking at how to support communities is at the kind of top of the congressional agenda, but it is not the only thing they're looking at. One thing they'll have to do is to pass spending bills. It's something that Congress has to do every year if they don't want the government to shut down. And I don't imagine that Congress is going to be all that interested in having the government shut down this year. And we've heard that at least in the Senate, they're looking at passing the spending bills as they normally would. We'll see if the timing gets affected because of Congress's ability to convene in person. But they are moving forward. And we also know that congressional staff are taking calls and taking meetings on quite a number of other issues, including climate change, including hazard response, and a number of the other areas that we've touched on today. So please don't think that you can't be in touch with your legislators on other issues.
Awesome, thank you, Lexi. I'm going to direct this next question to Michael. I have a question here about the diversity, equity, and inclusion advocacy days that were mentioned earlier in the presentation. I was wondering if, Michael, you could share some of the actions that we're hoping to take over that week or 2 weeks of advocacy and what we're hoping to get out of that experience.
Sure. So yeah, so the goal here, kind of the purpose is to demonstrate to members of Congress kind of the importance of diversity, equity, inclusion to science and the scientific community, and to broaden participation in these efforts to Earth and space scientists who may not already be actively involved in these efforts. And specific goal here for this particular event for these weeks is to advance legislation that seeks to increase diversity, equity, inclusion in science to STEM professionals. So participants will, set up virtual meetings with their members of Congress during that window of time, June 15th through the 26th. We're also going to be providing a social media toolkit for people who want to contact their leaders via social media. And we'll also provide other, kind of digital virtual opportunities during those weeks as well. And included in the event is also going to be a virtual training that we will be holding on Tuesday, June 9th from 1 to 3:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time to kind of help give participants additional information and tips on how to make those meetings successful.
Awesome, thank you for that, Michael. So we're gonna end on just one last question. Thank you again to everybody for taking the time to participate and to spend this afternoon with us. We really appreciate it. The final question to the full team, for anybody who wants to jump in, are there any policy opportunities or experiences or opportunities that have presented themselves in this really strange time of handling the COVID-19 pandemic that might not have presented itself if it was business as usual? Anything that we're able to advocate for now that has been a unique opportunity?
This is Lexi. I'll jump in on that. One of the things that I think has really been driven home over the last few months is how important science is to support our nation and to help keep us safe. More than we've seen in quite some time, there is just a hunger for valid scientific information, certainly at the state and local levels. And that really gives us as the science community an opportunity to weigh in with legislators about how that community needs support if it's going to be able to provide the information that people really need to survive and to thrive. So I would call that a real kind of opportunity, a lemonade out of these lemons.
Fantastic, thank you, Lexi. And so that's going to conclude our session for today. Thank you again to our speakers and to all of you for tuning in and taking the time to engage with us on these issues, technical difficulties included. You'll receive an email next week with access to the recording of today's webinar and a few of the resources that we mentioned. And we hope you leave today feeling a little more inspired to advocate for science in whatever way you can. Thank you all and have a great rest of your afternoon.